Some things a man learns in silence, long before he learns them in words. That love, when it comes, does not always arrive on horseback with a promise or a ring or a fine speech rehearsed on the ride into town. Sometimes it arrives on a Tuesday, in a pair of muddy boots, carrying 2 eggs wrapped in a scrap of blue cloth. And sometimes a man does not know his life has already turned until he catches himself smiling at a fence post that was not there the week before, or a step that no longer cracks under his heel, or a small square of morning light falling on a table where, for 6 long years, there had only ever been shadow and the memory of a woman he could not save. The ranch was falling apart, but her smile was worth saving. That was the thought Ethan Callaway would not admit to himself for the better part of a year, though every other soul in Silver Creek could see it plain as the sun on the San Juan peaks. Ethan was 32 years old that April of 1887, a widower 6 years running, with 320 acres of thin grass west of the Durango Road, 42 head of mixed shorthorn cattle, a bay gelding named Solomon, a pair of barn cats with no names to speak of, and a house whose east porch had leaned south since the winter his wife Rose had died of a fever the doctor had ridden 90 miles in the snow to try and fail to break. He kept it that way not from laziness. He kept it that way because straightening it felt, in some quiet corner of him, like admitting the years had passed, and that the woman who had loved that porch was no longer coming out to sit on it in the evenings with a cup of coffee and a shawl around her shoulders. Sarah Whitfield was 29 and had been the schoolteacher at Silver Creek for 4 springs. She was small-boned and sharp-eyed, with hair the color of dry cottonwood bark that she wore pinned up under a plain straw hat in summer and a dark wool bonnet in winter, and a laugh that only came out when she was not trying to be a schoolteacher. She lived alone in the 2-room cabin behind the schoolhouse. She kept 6 brown-laying hens in a wire coop she had built herself, board by board, the first autumn she came to the territory from a small town outside Pueblo where her mother had taught before her, and her mother before that. She walked, most Tuesdays after her afternoon lessons, the 1.25 miles up the wagon road to the Callaway place with 2 brown eggs wrapped in a scrap of blue cloth, because she had once heard Ethan tell the smith he was down to bread and beans and coffee, and she had never quite been able to stop remembering it. She told herself, for the first year, that it was neighborly. She told herself, for the second year, that she was worried about him, the way a decent person worries about a neighbor who has lost too much and been too quiet about the losing. By the 3rd year she had stopped telling herself anything at all. She just walked up the road on Tuesdays with 2 eggs in a scrap of blue cloth and said very little and left before the coffee was quite gone from the pot. Ethan, for his part, told himself he was grateful for the eggs. He told himself he was grateful for the company. He told himself many things in the long evenings after she had gone, sitting on his lopsided porch with the sun setting behind the ridge and the cattle low in the far pasture, and only one of the things he told himself was true, and that was the one he could not say out loud, not to himself and not to God and not to any living person in the territory. The town, of course, saw everything. The town always sees everything. Widow Alma Beecher, who ran the boarding house on 2nd Street and had buried 2 husbands of her own, said to the postmaster one October afternoon that Ethan Callaway was the slowest man in the territory, and that if she were 20 years younger and 80 pounds lighter she would march up that wagon road herself and shake sense into him with both hands. The postmaster, whose name was Henry Doyle and who read every newspaper that came through his window whether it was addressed to him or not, said he thought Ethan was not slow but afraid, and that afraid men needed patience, not shaking. Old Cal Meriwether, sitting on the bench outside the mercantile with a hand-carved pipe that had been his father's before him, said neither of them knew what they were talking about, and that a man who had buried a wife young does not court again the way other men do. He courts by staying alive. He courts by fixing what is broken. And when the schoolteacher, Cal said, finally stops coming up that road on Tuesdays, then Ethan Callaway will know what he already knows. Not before. The 4 of them, together with the Reverend's wife Ellen Hartley, would become what Sarah would later call, half laughing and half annoyed, the town chorus. They would see it all long before either of the 2 people it concerned would say a single word about it out loud. The first Tuesday of April, Sarah came up the road with the eggs and a folded copy of the Denver paper under her arm. The porch was leaning worse than the winter before. The east step had cracked clean through at the corner. The pump handle had a wobble that made the water spit sideways into the dust when you worked it. She noticed each of these things the way a woman notices a man's rough hands and does not comment on them. She set the eggs on the kitchen table. Ethan poured coffee from the tin pot on the stove. They did not speak for the first 4 minutes, and this was not awkward. This was how it had always been. She said, "At last, the porch is worse." He said, "I know." She said, "You could fix it." He said, "I could." And she said nothing more because she had learned, over 3 years of Tuesdays, not to push a man like Ethan Callaway. But when she left that afternoon, she walked slower than usual down the wagon road, and she stopped once at the bend where the cottonwoods thinned, and she looked back at the house, and something in her chest tightened in a way she did not have a name for. That night, Ethan sat on his lopsided porch with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand and looked at the crooked post. He thought of his wife Rose, who had loved that porch, and who had once said, in the last summer of her life, that she wanted to sit on it every evening of every year they had left. He thought of Sarah, who had walked away slower than usual and had looked back at the bend. And he thought, without meaning to, of what Cal Merriweather had once said in the Mercantile, that a man courts by fixing what is broken. He set the cup down on the porch rail. He stood up. He went inside. He went to bed. He did not sleep for a long time. But in the morning, before the sun was fully up over the eastern ridge, he was in the barn pulling out the good milled cedar he had bought 2 summers back from a mill in Pueblo and never used, because he had never quite been able to decide what to build with it and, in truth, had never quite been able to decide that he wanted to build anything at all. He did not tell anyone. He did not tell Sarah. He simply began, at dawn on a Wednesday, to straighten the east porch of the Callaway house. The work took him 11 days. He replaced the 2 rotted joists first, kneeling in the dirt beneath the porch with his shoulders wedged against beams older than his father and the smell of dry earth and rot in his nose. He pulled the cracked step and cut a new one from the cedar, planing it smooth on the sawhorse in the yard while Solomon watched from the corral with the polite disinterest of horses. He set the new post plumb and true, checking it 3 times against a string weighted with a horseshoe nail. He did not hurry. He worked before the sun and after supper, and the middle of the day belonged to the cattle. The work was quiet and unwitnessed, except by the 2 barn cats and the bay gelding, and on the 7th day, a red-tailed hawk that circled the yard twice and moved on. The work was, more than anything else, a prayer he did not know he was saying, and the person he was saying it to did not yet know she was being prayed for. On the 4th evening, when he came in with sawdust in his hair and blood dried across 2 knuckles, he found Rose's old shawl still folded on the back of the kitchen chair where it had sat for 6 years, and he did not move it, but he did, for the first time in a long while, touch it once with the flat of his hand before he lit the lamp. On the 9th evening, sitting alone on the half-finished porch with a plate of bread and cold beans across his knee, he watched the moon come up white behind the ridge and thought, without meaning to, that he was tired in a way he had not been tired in years, and that the tiredness was a good tiredness, and that he had not known how much he had missed being tired for a reason. The following Tuesday, Sarah came up the road with the eggs. She stopped at the bend. She saw the porch. It was straight. It was plumb. The east step was new cedar, still pale as bone and smelling faintly of resin. The pump handle no longer wobbled. Even the sagging rail along the east side had been trued and renailed. She did not go on for a full minute. She stood in the road with the eggs in her hand and looked at the house, and something in her chest that had been tightening for 3 years slid, all at once, into place. She could not have said what she felt. If pressed, she might have said only that the house looked, for the first time since she had begun coming up that road, like a house a person lived in on purpose. She went the rest of the way. She set the eggs on the table. She did not mention the porch. Neither did he. They drank their coffee. She left. But when she got back to her cabin behind the schoolhouse, she sat down on her narrow bed still in her coat and pressed her hands to her mouth and did not move for a long, long time. The town chorus, of course, noticed everything. Widow Beecher said to the postmaster the next morning, "He fixed the porch." Henry Doyle said, "I saw. Rode past it twice on the mail run." Old Cal Merriweather, from his bench, said, "That's the first stitch." Ellen Hartley, the Reverend's wife, said only that she would pray for both of them, which in her particular vocabulary meant that she was as thrilled as she permitted herself to be in public. Now here is where a lesser story would rush. But Ethan Callaway did not rush, and neither will this one. Because after the porch came the pump. And after the pump came the barn door that had sagged on its lower hinge for 2 years and a half. And after the barn door came the small, strange thing that mattered more than any of the others. It was late May by then. The cottonwoods were fully out along the creek and the pasture grass was up past a man's ankle. Sarah had begun, without quite meaning to stay a little longer on Tuesdays. Not by much. 10 minutes. 15. Long enough for a second cup of coffee that neither of them acknowledged as a second cup. She had also begun, in her cabin at night, to catch herself thinking about the light in the Callaway kitchen. It was a poor kitchen for light. The one window faced north, and by 4 in the afternoon the room went blue and cold and the tin pot on the stove threw no shine at all. She had said once, only once, half to herself while stirring her coffee at his table, that it was a pity the kitchen didn't get the morning sun. She had not meant it as anything but an observation, made mostly to the coffee. She had said it and forgotten she had said it before she was halfway back down the wagon road. She had, however, said it on a Tuesday, which Ethan noticed, and which he later noticed he had noticed, and which, he came to understand, over the long slow week that followed, was the smallest sort of holy thing a woman could accidentally give a man who had been listening for 6 years without knowing what he was listening for. Ethan had remembered. He had remembered it that evening and the next morning and every morning for 3 weeks after, and had ridden all the way to Pueblo and back 2 full days on Solomon, to buy the one thing he did not have and could not make with his own hands. 3 weeks later she came up the road on a Tuesday and stopped again at the bend and looked at the house, and she did not move for a full 2 minutes. Because there was a new window in the east wall of the kitchen. It had not been there the Tuesday before. It was small and square and framed in the same pale cedar as the porch step, and it was set exactly where the morning sun would fall across the kitchen table between 7 and 9 in the morning. The glass was good glass, not the wavy pane he could have gotten cheap at the mercantile, but the good clear glass that had to be freighted in from Pueblo and cost a full day's cattle sale. She walked the rest of the way slowly. Her throat had gone tight in a way it had not gone since her mother had died. She did not know why she was about to cry, and she did not cry because she was Sarah Whitfield and she did not cry at fence posts and windows. But when she came into the kitchen and set the eggs on the table she looked at the new window and she looked at Ethan and she said very quietly, "You built a window." He said, "The kitchen was dark in the afternoons." She said, "You built a window facing east." He said, "So you'd have good light." He did not know he had said it. Neither did she for a full 4 seconds. And then they both did, and neither of them looked at the other for a long minute after because some things are too large to be looked at directly the first time. He turned to the stove. She turned to the window. The room, for a moment, held its breath the way a room does when something has just quietly been decided in it. He poured the coffee. She sat down. The morning light was not on the table at that hour because it was afternoon, but the window was there all the same, and it would be there tomorrow morning and every morning after, and both of them knew it. She said, "After a long time, Ethan." He said, "I know." She said nothing else. She drank her coffee. She left. But at the bend in the road she stopped again, and this time she pressed her hand flat against her chest for a long moment before she walked on. She did not know then that she had been seen. She did not know then that the town chorus was already at work. That is what love looks like when it doesn't announce itself. It just quietly faces east. Now the town chorus, having watched all this from the vantage of the mercantile bench and the boarding house porch and the post office window, had by early June decided that a small intervention was in order. Because there was a complication, and the complication had a name, and the name was Marcus Halloran. Marcus was a decent man. It is important to say that plainly because a lesser story would make him a villain, and he was not one. He was 36, unmarried, and had recently taken over his uncle's freight business north of town on the Durango Road. He was fair, he was well-spoken, and he had begun, over the past 2 months, to call politely at Sarah's cabin on Sunday afternoons. He brought her books. He brought her, once, a tin of good Denver coffee. He spoke to her about the school, about the territory, about the possibility that Silver Creek would one day have a proper library and a proper printing press and, God willing, a proper doctor. Sarah did not dislike him. She did not, in truth, dislike anything about him. That was part of the problem. The town chorus saw this too. Widow Beecher, in particular, saw it and worried. Because Marcus was the kind of man a small-town schoolteacher was expected to marry. Educated, prosperous, present, and unafraid of a Sunday call. And Ethan Callaway was the kind of man who might, if left to his own devices, spend another 6 years building windows and never once saying what any of them meant. Ellen Hartley, who was gentler than Widow Beecher and slower to speak, said only that the Lord had his timing on such matters and that a good porch was, in her considered opinion, a form of prayer whether the builder knew it or not. Henry Doyle, at the post office window, said nothing at all, but was seen, on the following Tuesday, to ride past the Callaway place a third time on the mail run, which was one more pass than the route required, and no one in the town chorus was fool enough to mention it to him. Cal Merriweather, however, was patient. Cal Merriweather had buried his own wife 30 years back and had done his own late, slow courting, and he knew what he knew. "Leave him be," Cal said, on the bench outside the mercantile, when Widow Beecher raised the matter of Marcus Halloran for the third time that week. "He's building. He's building windows, Cal. That is building." The turning came in the third week of June. There was a summer social at the Grange Hall, as there always was, with lanterns strung across the porch and a fiddler up from Durango and a pot of Ellen Hartley's plum punch. Sarah wore her good dress, which was a high-necked, long-sleeved dark green wool that had been her mother's, and she pinned her hair up with her mother's tortoiseshell comb. Ethan came in his one clean shirt, a gray broadcloth, which he had ironed himself and unevenly along the placket. Marcus Halloran came in a proper suit with a proper tie, having ridden down from his freight office that afternoon in a buggy polished for the occasion. Marcus asked Sarah to dance. She said yes because she was polite, and because refusing would have made a small thing into a large one in a town where small things always became large ones. They danced 2 turns. He was a good dancer. He was, in every particular that could be counted, a good man. Ethan stood by the door and did not look at them. He drank his punch slowly. He spoke to old Cal, who spoke to him about nothing in particular, which was Cal's kindness. Halfway through the second turn, Marcus said, quietly, to Sarah, "May I speak to you a moment outside?" She said yes. They went out onto the porch of the Grange Hall, where the lanterns were softer and the fiddler music came thin through the wall. Marcus was, as always, courteous. He said what men in his position say when they mean it. He said he had come to hold her in the highest regard. He said he was not a man to move without consideration. He said that if she would allow it, he would like to speak to her of a future, and of what that future might look like and whether she might see a place in it for him. Sarah looked at him. He was, again, a good man. He deserved a straight answer spoken in daylight terms. She said, "Marcus." He said, "Yes." She said, "You are kind, and I am honored. But my answer is no, and it has been no for longer than I have understood it was no." He was quiet for a long moment. He looked, not at her, but out past the lanterns at the dark line of the ridge. Then he said, "It's Ethan Callaway, isn't it?" She said, "Yes." He said, "He is a good man too." She said, "I know." He was quiet again. And then, and this is what a lesser story would have made impossible, he did not step aside gently. He said, "May I say a thing, Sarah, before I go?" She said, "Yes." He said, "I have watched him for 2 months. I have watched him not speak. And I will confess to you, plainly and without pride, that I do not think it is fair to a woman for a man to keep her waiting on a silence he will not break. I could not, in good conscience, walk away tonight and let a woman I respect be won by silence alone. So I will say this. If he does not speak to you, if he does not say the thing tonight or soon, I will be back next spring, and I will not be so patient the second time. Not because I do not respect him, because I do, and because I respect you more." He said it without threat. He said it as a fact. He said it, in fact, with the quiet dignity of a man who understood he was losing and had decided to lose well, but not before he had said one true thing that cost him to say. And then he took his hat from the porch rail and he tipped it to her and he went back inside, and he shook Ethan Callaway's hand at the door as he left, firmly and without a word, and Ethan did not, at the time, understand why. And 30 minutes later Marcus Halloran went home the long way up the Durango road. Sarah stood alone on the porch of the Grange Hall for a long time after. The fiddle played. The lanterns swung. And then the door opened and Ethan Callaway came out, because Cal Merriweather had, with the exquisite tact of a man who has waited 30 years for this exact evening, told him to. Now the confrontation had to be staged somewhere, and the fence line was where it belonged. But there was no fence at the Grange Hall. So they walked. They walked out past the lanterns and down the wagon road and out to the split-rail fence at the near edge of the Callaway property, where the road curved and the creek ran soft in the dark under a stand of cottonwood. It was 1.25 miles. Neither of them spoke for the whole of it, except once, when Sarah stumbled on a root and Ethan caught her elbow and did not let go for 2 seconds longer than he needed to. At the fence, they stopped. The moon was up, 3/4 full and pale. The cottonwoods were black against the sky. The creek talked to itself in that low way creeks talk when no one is listening. She said, "Ethan." He said, "Sarah." She said, "You built a window facing east." He said, "I did." She said, "Why?" And this was the moment. This was the moment the whole 3 years had been walking toward. He did not answer for a long time. He put both hands on the top rail of the fence, and she could see, even in the moonlight, that they were shaking a little. He looked out across the dark pasture, at the low shape of the barn he had straightened and the porch he had trued and the small pale square in the east wall of the kitchen where, in 7 hours or so, the sun would come. And then, without looking at her, he said the thing he had not said for 6 years to anyone, and had never in his life said to her. He said, "The ranch was falling apart, but your smile was worth saving. And I did not know how to say that. So I built you a window." She did not speak. She reached out and put her hand on his hand on the fence rail. She did not look at him either. They stood like that, the two of them, at the fence line where the road curved, and the creek ran, and the town chorus was, though neither of them knew it, on the porch of the Grange Hall 1 mile back, watching a single lantern burn late at the edge of the Callaway pasture and, one by one, letting themselves smile. Grief does not leave. It just learns to share the house with other things. It learns to sit at the far end of the table while other, newer things take the near seat. It learns to be quiet in the presence of a small pale square of morning light. It learns, in the end, that it was never the enemy of joy, only its older brother. They were married in the last week of September, in the small chapel next to the schoolhouse, with the cottonwoods gone gold along the creek and the San Juans already dusted white at their tops. Ellen Hirtley cruid. Widow Beecher cried. Cal Merriweather did not cry because he was Cal, but he sat in the second pew with his pipe in his coat pocket and his hands folded on his knee, and when the vows were spoken he closed his eyes for a moment and thanked, silently, whoever it was he thanked for such things. Sarah wore a high-necked ivory dress, long-sleeved and long-skirted, with a small sprig of dried sage pinned at her collar because it had been Rose's favorite, and she had, on her own and without telling anyone, gone up to the small hill above the Callaway pasture the morning before and cut it herself. Ethan wore the same gray broadcloth shirt he had worn to the Grange Hall, only this time properly ironed, because Widow Beecher had gotten to it that morning and had refused to be turned away at the door. They did not have a long ceremony. Neither of them was long ceremony people. But when the Reverend asked Ethan to speak his vow, Ethan looked at Sarah and he said, plainly and without flourish, "The ranch was falling apart. But your smile was worth saving. And I mean to keep saving it, for as long as I am given to." Sarah did cry a little then, but only a little, because she was Sarah Whitfield and she did not cry, and she was about to stop being Sarah Whitfield and start being Sarah Callaway, and neither of those women were the crying kind. The town chorus, in the back pew, wept openly and without dignity, and Cal Merriweather allowed himself, at last, one small satisfied nod. They lived, from that autumn on, in the Callaway house. Sarah kept teaching for 2 more years, then stopped when the first child came in the spring of 1890, and by then the porch had been repainted twice and the east window was the warmest spot in the kitchen every morning between 7 and 9. Marcus Halloran did not come back the next spring, or the one after. He married a schoolteacher of his own, 2 towns over on the Pueblo Road, and by all accounts was happy. That is what a good man does when he loses well. He goes on, and he does not look back with bitterness, and he lets the story belong to the people who earned it. The town chorus, in time, thinned. Cal Merriweather died in the winter of 1893, sitting up in his chair by the mercantile stove, with his pipe in his hand and no particular fuss. Widow Beecher followed 2 years later, in the spring of 1895, of a cough she had ignored one winter too many. Henry Doyle, the postmaster, retired the same year and moved south to be near his sister. Ellen Hartley outlived them all and, when she was very old, told the story of the Callaways and the window facing east to any child who would sit still long enough to hear it, and even to some who wouldn't. And every Tuesday, for the rest of her long life, Sarah Callaway kept, on the shelf above the stove beside the tin coffee pot, a folded scrap of blue cloth. She never explained it to anyone, not to her children and not to her grandchildren. She did not need to. It sat there, faded and soft with the years, and every Tuesday morning the sun would come through the east window and fall across the shelf and light the blue cloth up like a small flag, and Sarah would look at it and smile and go on with her morning. The children grew and married and left and came back on holidays with children of their own. Ethan's hair went silver at the temples first and then all through. The bay gelding Solomon died at 22 years old in the pasture behind the barn, and Ethan buried him himself on a gray November afternoon and did not speak for the rest of that day. But every morning between 7 and 9, the light came through the east window, and every morning Sarah poured 2 cups of coffee, and every morning Ethan sat down across from her, and neither of them ever, in 41 years of marriage, said aloud what they both knew that light was for. Now listen, friend. If you have watched this far, then this next part is for you, and it is not for the story. It is for your own life. Somewhere, right now, there is a porch leaning south in yours. There is a pump that wobbles when you work the handle. There is a kitchen that gets no morning light. And somewhere, walking up a road you have not yet noticed, is a person carrying 2 eggs in a scrap of cloth and hoping, without saying it, that you will notice them one Tuesday. You do not have to be loud about it. You do not have to make a speech. You do not have to be Marcus Halloran on the porch of the Grange Hall with your good suit and your good words, honorable as those were. You can be Ethan Callaway, at dawn on a Wednesday, in the barn, with a piece of milled cedar and 11 days of quiet work ahead of you. You can build a window facing east. You can straighten a step. You can true a fence rail. You can carry 2 eggs up a road for 3 years and never once ask why. And if the person you build it for is the right person, they will stop at the bend in the road, and they will see it, and they will know, without a word being spoken between you, the whole of what you meant. That is what love looks like when it doesn't announce itself. It just quietly faces east. Thank you, friend, for sitting a while with us here at Frontier Hearts. If the story warmed something in you, know that it warmed us too, in the telling. Until next time, keep riding. And if you have a little more time tonight, stay a spell longer with us. Because next, up the creek from the Callaway place, there is a widowed blacksmith named Josiah Reed who does not yet know that the widow Alma Beecher has begun, on Thursdays, to send her nephew down to his forge with a broken kettle that is not, in fact, broken. That story is called He Said He Didn't Need a Wife, until the kettle kept coming back. Click it now, friend, and ride with us a little further down the creek.